Hello my friends, in today's video we will take a look at the cameras on iPhone 14 Pro. 14 Pro is another generation of iPhones with significant camera hardware changes. After the introduction of a larger sensor in 12 and 13 Pro, 14 Pro introduces a higher resolution and other improvements made possible by the new hardware. In this video we will take a look at the performance and the feature set of 14 Pro's camera setup to find out how good it really is. The camera unit is substantial, which is hardly a surprise. It is not that much bigger than the camera setup on 13 Pro though, so if you are able to get used to the 13 Pro, this shouldn't be much of an issue. There is some serious hardware inside of that camera bump, so it should be worth it. Importantly, the lenses seem to be a lot larger in this generation, which is actually one of the most important changes. Importantly, we are getting the full camera capabilities on the non-Max 14 Pro. On the Pro version, we have the ultra-wide 13mm lens, wide 24mm lens, and 77mm telephoto. The main camera uses a 1/1.28" type sensor paired with a 24mm equivalent f1.8 lens. By smartphone standards, this is a very large sensor. 48 megapixel resolution is a big departure from 12 megapixels, but we will get to that in a minute. 24mm focal length on the main camera is a change in comparison to 26mm on older iPhones. I approve of this change. 24mm is in my opinion a more interesting focal length, a little bit more immersive and very suitable for landscape, cities, architecture and so on. That 48 megapixel resolution also makes the zoom much more usable, but we will also get to that later. First, let's talk about the image quality. This segment needs to be split in RAW part and JPEG part. 48 megapixel RAWs are a real deal. The amount of detail captured in these 48 megapixel RAWs is incredible. High-resolution smartphone sensors are not a novelty, but iPhone 14 Pro combines that resolution with a lens that apparently can work with that kind of pixel density, which is a major technological achievement. I will compare this resolution to various devices in the near future to put it into a context, but I can already say that 48 megapixels is a real feature of iPhone 14 Pro, not just a number for marketing. The non-RAW photos still follow the usual iPhone philosophy. First of all, these are limited to 12 megapixels. 48 megapixel resolution is only available for RAW. HEIC images use a lot of sharpening and various methods of adding artificial texture and contrast. The amount of detail is still very solid though. This is largely a matter of opinion and preference, but I would prefer more subtle in-camera processing. It is not that bad though. These are still nice iPhone images, but if you want to get anywhere near the full potential of the camera hardware, you will have to shoot RAW. Another huge benefit of that 48 megapixel sensor is that it makes the zoom much more usable. Instead of using digital zoom, it uses so-called live cropping, which means that it is just cropping that 48 megapixel shot. That means that even 2x zoom, which is preset in the camera app, offers a real 12 megapixel resolution. The image quality is very good. It is actually better than the real 2x or 50mm equivalent camera on 12 Pro. The amount of detail is definitely good enough for intended purposes. Regarding the in-camera processing, there is a moderate amount of so-called oil painting effect at 2x zoom. You still have to shoot RAW to get the best image quality at 2x. The ultra-wide camera now uses a 12 megapixel 1/2.55" type sensor, which is a pretty large sensor for an ultra-wide camera. Ultra-wide camera on 14 Pro finally combines that dramatic 13mm equivalent field of view with very solid image quality. The image quality obviously can't match the main camera, but again, it is more than good enough for intended purposes. The most important thing about the ultra-wide camera is that it offers that very dramatic field of view, which in turn gives you a lot of creative options. Regarding the processing, that is still the same deal. If you don't like excessive amount of sharpening and contrast, you will have to shoot RAW. The telephoto camera has the same specifications as the one on 13 Pro, but the overall image quality seems to be a lot better. I didn't like the 77mm focal length as a replacement of 50mm on 13 Pro, but now that we have a solid 50mm option, I am glad that the 77mm is here. It uses the smallest 1/3.5" type sensor, but the images still look nice. The processing actually seems to be the least intrusive. It is useful for objects that are far away and also for portraits to a certain extent. Regarding the dynamic range and options for editing, ProRAW files are fantastic, much like with previous iPhones. They put together multiple images with different exposures to preserve the detail in both highlights and shadows. When you combine that with a naturally good dynamic range of the main sensor, the results are great. Apple has implemented the stacked RAW feature perfectly. The colors are still relatively vibrant, but I am quite impressed with the accuracy. Even the images taken on a cloudy day look very natural, and it can get the white balance right in the majority of situations. The skin tones are improved as well, but there are still situations where they may not look very natural. These situations are a lot less frequent though. It seems that HDR processing in stills has been significantly toned down and it looks much more natural. The low-light performance is great. 14 Pro uses well-known night mode with long exposure and stacking. It works really well in combination with a larger sensor. There is almost no noise, the colors look natural, and importantly, it is not trying to turn the night into a day. iPhones used to have issues with lens flare during the night. You may still encounter it, but I would say that it was reduced probably by 80%. The video has always been a strength of iPhones and it still is, but there are some nuances. The main camera uses a simple 4:1 pixel binning when shooting video, so the amount of detail is very solid. 24mm focal length is in my opinion a clear benefit for the video because there is additional amount of crop needed for the stabilization, so now we are getting roughly 26 to 28mm focal length after the stabilization. The processing is basically the same deal as with the JPEG stills. There is a lot of sharpening and added texture. The HDR processing seems to be significantly toned down. I have still encountered some situations with infamous overexposed blue shadows, but these situations are much less frequent. There are also very rare situations where the processing is completely clueless, but you realistically shouldn't encounter those situations too often. Using Filmic Pro instead of the default camera app also makes a significant difference in some scenes as it tones down the HDR effect even more, but it can't fix the sharpening which is baked in. I will be using Filmic Pro for video most of the time. 2x video still looks good, there is a little bit of oil painting effect, but it isn't that bad. Ultra-wide video is actually very nice, that ultra-wide angle probably makes that heavy processing less noticeable, so I like it a lot. 3x video is also fine. I would say that it is similar to 2x video. The low-light video is a very pleasant surprise. It can't use long exposure in video, but it still looks really good. The amount of noise is very low and there is very little loss of detail caused by the denoising. It also gets the white balance right with the most type of artificial light. Overall, I am very happy with the low-light video as well, that is a big strength of iPhone 14 Pro. I can say that the 4K video out of the iPhone 14 Pro is very solid by smartphone standards, but I believe that the hardware is capable of producing even better results than the software allows at the moment. The stabilization is an area where I have no complaints whatsoever. Much like the 13 Pro, 14 Pro uses sensor stabilization on the main camera. Static shots and panning are super smooth, there is not much to talk about there. The party trick is the walking stabilization. That is still super impressive, this kind of stabilization would be completely impossible without a gimbal just a couple of years ago. The ultra-wide camera uses digital image stabilization, but that is completely sufficient at that angle. The stabilization on the telephoto camera is also fine. The lens stabilization stabilizes static shots very effectively, and that is basically all that I should ask at 77mm focal length. Regarding the autofocus, there is not much to talk about. On the main camera it is basically perfect. The focusing is extremely fast, the accuracy is 100% and there is no hunting even in the low light. The same is true for both stills and video. It slows down a little bit on the telephoto lens in the low light, but it is still very good overall. The ultra-wide camera also uses autofocus. The depth of field on that one is so deep that it works pretty much seamlessly. The main reason for the autofocus are probably the macro capabilities. It can focus at extremely close distance and take these macro shots with an interesting perspective. At this focal length you will get a lot of distortion, so it is not suitable for every subject. One more thing that affects iPhone photography a lot is the display. It is still a 6.1-inch 460 pixels per inch display with 120 Hz refresh rate, but the brightness is now 2000 nits, which is useful for outdoors photography. As usual, all kinds of content look great on this screen. The most noticeable difference is that the signature notch was replaced by pill-shaped cutout. The dynamic island functionality is in my opinion great, but I haven't noticed any photography-related dynamic island actions. Maybe in the later versions of iOS. Always on display is also a great feature finally available on iPhone, but much like with the dynamic island, not related to the camera functionality. The display is great overall, it is an excellent OLED panel with great contrast and brightness as well as the colors, so I have nothing to complain about. Another feature that indirectly affects the camera experience is the battery, which is not that great at the moment. 14 Pro has increased battery capacity at 3200 mAh, but there seem to be some issues related to iOS 16. I have also noticed worse battery life on my 13 Pro, so I won't draw any conclusions at the moment, and I will hope that it will be fixed. It is not terrible though, it will still get through a full day of heavy use. To sum up, I am very happy with the camera setup on iPhone 14 Pro. That large 48 megapixel sensor is indeed a big step forward. In combination with 24mm focal length and Pro RAW, it can go pretty deep into the territory of dedicated cameras. That is a great achievement. The return of 2x zoom is also great news. The low light is very solid and the stabilization is fantastic. Ultra-wide camera is now better than ever and it generally takes very nice images. Video continues to be a strength of iPhones. The JPEG or non-RAW processing is not quite bad, but after seeing what the RAWs can do, I think that there is some work that needs to be done. I don't know whether this is what the general public prefers, but the gap between the RAWs and the JPEGs is very significant. At the very least, 48 megapixel JPEGs should be available. I also like the rest of the iPhone, including the display and immense processing power. I think that it is the most interesting iPhone since the iPhone X, and the camera is a big part of that. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.